Thank you. So welcome to this webinar on Searching Southeast Asia in the Modern World, a webinar brought to you by the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub in partnership with the Department of History of De La Salle University, Manila. So this afternoon, we have two speakers and two discussants. I'm one of the speakers. My name is Dr. Fernando Santiago Jr. I'm the director of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and we're joined by highly esteemed colleagues in the field of history. Dr. Jose Victor Torres will be a fellow speaker. Dr. Maria Florina Aurelius Piangsak Hongjam Rasil of Thammasat University, Thailand, who is also one of our docents. So before we proceed to the lectures, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maria Florina Aurelius Juan, who will give the welcome remarks. And by the way, Dr. Maria Aurelius Juan is the chairman of the History Department of De La Salle University. So, Dr. Aurelius Juan.
Thank you, Fernie. A warm afternoon to all the participants of this webinar. As the COVID-19 pandemic forced us to stay, work, and study from the comforts of our own home, educational institutions like De La Salle University, Manila, and academic departments and research centers like the DLSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub started to organize webinars or online trainings that allowed us to continue to learn, broaden, and deepen our knowledge on various topics. An example of this is DLS Research's initiative to hold a series of webinars that tackle a timely topic like COVID-19. This afternoon, we will shift gears a bit with the theme Searching Southeast Asia in the Modern World, a historical webinar. You will be given the opportunity to actively participate in the open forum, and I do hope that you will stay with us until the end of this session. Now, I will go directly to introducing the first speaker of this particular webinar. And let me just mention that I am so proud of these two colleagues of mine from the De La Salle University Department of History. Our first speaker is an associate professor of history at the De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. He also serves as a director of the search, who is actually responsible for organizing this series of webinars. To talk about his paper titled Understanding the Filipinos' Sense of Malayness, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Fernando A. Santiago Jr.
Thank you, Dr. Aurelius Juan. Let me just share my screen. The title of my paper, well, my presentation is Understanding the Filipino Sense of Malayness. It is based on a conference paper to be published by the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Malaysia. Okay, so what I'm sharing is basically, well, it's derived from that paper. Okay, and I'm sharing ideas that I think would be relevant
Test. Okay. Am I on? Mm. Can you hear
Sir
me?
Vic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm okay.
okay. I think we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Can we just wait for a while until our host is able to log in again? Unless, of course, Dr. Torres, you want to go ahead with your lecture?
Yeah, if you don't, if Fernie won't mind. So far, I'm getting
Okay, so
responses
let me
na
just introduce you, Dr. Torres. Can I just introduce you and then you can proceed with your lecture?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Okay. Our next speaker is full professor of history at De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines, and associate director for drama and history at the Bienvenido Santos Creative Writing Center in the same university. He is a multi-awarded writer, winning the prestigious Carlos Palanca Memorial Award for Literature 5 times and the National Book Award twice, to talk about the library on your desk, historical research in the age of the internet and digitized sources. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jose Victor Torres.
Hi, good afternoon to all of you. Our apologies for the technical problems that we are experiencing right now, but hopefully everything will be good by as the time goes on. I'll be talking about what some of my companions have been saying to me that finally the my topic is addressing what they call the elephant in the room. So basically, I'll be talking about library research, the research that we are doing right now on uh, on the internet. On the internet, no? And how much the internet, no, has totally changed the way we are doing research, no, not only in the field of historical research, but also in the field of humanities and the field of sciences. Okay, I'm going to activate my screen for my PowerPoint. No, kindly be patient. Okay, the title of my lecture is "The Library on Your Desk: Doing Historical Research in the Age of the Internet and Digitized Sources." Okay, so research plays a large part in both, as I said a while ago, it plays a large part in both the field of the sciences and the humanities. But in order to do research, two basic needs have to be addressed. One is of course you need the resources, and the second one is you need sources. Okay, so in this lecture, I'll be discussing the role of the internet, the digitization, such a long word, a digitization of sources in historical research, and the plus and minus of this factor in the world of research today. The lecture is in three parts. One, researching history before. The third, the second part is, of course, the internet and digitization. And the last part is, of course, the problems that have been encountered. Okay, so let's go to the first part. Researching history before. Before the arrival of the internet, a researcher must do the following things to do research. One, he must know the accessibility, no, of the sources that he was going to use. So while identify the places where the sources he needs can be found, and I'm sure that all of you who have done research find it very valuable that sometimes, well, always, that the some institutions publish their catalogs. No, and the they must publish the catalog, and of course, many of the sources can be found, no, in these listings. Second, of course, after you identify where the source can be found, you have to get permission to use the facility. Now, especially if these are rare books. Okay? And if these are rare books, well, um, sometimes the institution may or may not grant you permission unless of course the how big the necessity is. So it depends on the importance of the source that you're going to use for the research. Then of course the third factor for accessibility is you have to wait for permission to be given. And of course, if permission should be given, you're only given a limited amount of time for for the use of the primary source. Okay. Uh, I think this is basically encountered mostly in our local archives, no? Because there are points in time where you're only allowed to use a certain number of sources, and of course, once you finish using them, you have to go back the next day to do it to do additional research, and of course to use the same sources. So it's difficult. It's also, I would like to say, it's not necessarily a waste of time, but of course, if you are very much into the field that you have to do your research, these interruptions, of course, come at a very big sacrifice. Okay. Second uh, factor of how we researched before, resources. No, and I think we have encountered, many of us have encountered this, especially those doing Philippine history. You have to go to Spain, or you have to go to the United States, no? And of course you have to find a sponsor in order to go abroad. No? So going abroad means like visiting the archives, like the Archivo General for Spain, and of course the Library of Congress, so, and for um, for the United States. So just to look at the books and the manuscripts and documents. And of course, the biggest headache here is sometimes you're only limited to the number of days you're granted your visa. Uh, well, of course, the importance now is that many of the primary sources are only found in these foreign institutions. So many researchers have to make the most of their time by sacrificing a lot just to do research. Then, of course, the need for finances. You're looking for a sponsor. Where will you get the money? That's the big one of the problems. Of course, you are all excited if you get the money, but sometimes, at the rate the expenses are going on now, no, um, you have to really save a lot just to just to have just to save enough to do research and at the same time live on the resources that you have. Third, time. Now, so many researchers are actually teaching staff who have either to go on leave for work, or there's many of them are graduate students who have to go on leave for their studies to do research, since research requires both travel and time. And of course, if you look at the two earlier factors, you would see now that waiting for the permission, especially if these are private collections. I've had some experiences in getting permissions from private collections. It sometimes takes quite a while. Okay? And of course, the travel is always a big headache, no? Because you have, especially pag abroad, you have to allow yourself at least a day before going on your mission of researching. And lastly, technology. Even though there was no internet yet, there was already technology on how to deal with the primary sources. Because remember, rare books and documents are sometimes very have to be limited, no, in being handled by human hands. So what was the technology before? We have microfiche, we have microfilm, okay, and of course this microfiche and microfilms are operated, of course, by special machines that are found in the library. It's basically a basic requirement of any library to have a microfiche and the microfiche reader or a microfilm reader. No, the problem of the technology, this kind of technology, is that one, uh, they don't last long. The machines become obsolete, and once they become obsolete, that's it. No, you'll have the machine there for like 10 years inside an archive or a library. Then it breaks down. Then you realize that the model does not exist anymore to be repaired. Second, of course, because we are a tropical country, microfilms and microfiche deteriorates. Okay? I've had this experience before in researching in one of the university libraries in the Philippines. And they told me that the rare document can no longer be accessed because it's quite damaged. However, we have the microfilms. I go, okay, sige, I want to see, can I at least use the microfilm? So they checked the microfilm, and the microfilm was in a very sad state. So what was the solution? There was none. I can no longer access the document. And that's very painful, especially for researchers. It must be noted that limited accessibility also meant limited research outputs. You can only be limited by your research output by what you have researched because of the time that you have gone to the library or the archive or the private collection. So limited research outputs also meant limited dissemination of new knowledge. Okay? Keep that in mind. Keep those things in mind as we look now at the internet and digitization. Okay? So, as I state here, the internet and the digitization of sources has played a large role in today's research. In the case of sources, it placed thousands, and I literally use the word thousands of books, manuscripts, and documents, both rare, both modern, no, and archival, and rare, in the hands of researchers at the click of a mouse. I forgot to add here, it placed thousands of documents, books, and manuscripts from hundreds of libraries at the click of a mouse. Not only can researchers now access these digitized sources, they can also download it and own a copy that they can consult time and again and eventually return to in the middle of doing their research. It proved to be a very, very excellent way of addressing the um, the problem of research. Can you imagine if you have a 1T hard disk now or hard drive now, 1 terabyte hard drive? Can you imagine how many digitized sources can you place into that one small flat cube of a 1 terabyte hard drive? And you return to it from time and again. Whenever I say I have a very big library, I only sometimes meant that one T hard drive, no? That you can access again and again, no? And of course, um, going to do research at your leisure. No, I'm not being boastful or anything, but I have done almost and several research works, and I simply I didn't leave the house. Everything that I needed was accessible from the digitized sources that I downloaded. Okay. Second, communication. The internet has totally improved our communications with research and institutions. The emails, online meetings made the communications between researchers and institutions so easy, especially from libraries and archives abroad. Of course, you have to tackle with the time zones. No? But not only can these institutions facilitate requests, uh, they can also actually provide the needed sources because it's digitized. They can actually provide the needed sources online. I'll give you one classic example. No, I was a member of the Mojares panel. No, this was a panel that was trying to investigate or the research on the first mass that happened in the Philippines, because right now in the Philippines we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Christianization, commemoration of the arrival of Christianization in the Philippines. And it was so easy to access and communicate with all the institutions that had the manuscript of Antonio Pigafetta. Not only that, we managed to get also the digitized sources online. Although some of the staff from the National Historical Commission in the Philippines went abroad, no, to get the digitized sources. Okay, so communication became easier and the sending of materials became easier. Third, technology. Well, digitization made duplication of sources easier. When microfilm and microfiche was done, it was only one copy, and once the copy gets damaged, that's it. You have to go back to the original document again and microfilm it. Today, you digitize it once, and you can make like hundreds of copies. Although I'm not saying that special collections are easily digitized and shared. No? Some libraries today in institutions still keep a special clause for permission to have to have a copy of the sources from institutions. They're not entirely free. No? And of course, you have to understand that some of these collections are exclusively owned by the library. No? And well, they're not being selfish. It's just that they value it as part of their collections, their treasured collections. Okay. Lastly, of course, more research outputs. Since we have sources, of course, and the resources have become easier. The resources, I mean communication. Researchers now meant more outputs. Okay, and it also meant raising the bar in the quality of research work. There is always now, since everything now suddenly became an open field of research with all the sources, there is now the matter of raising the quality of research. Mahirap na, well, it's difficult that you suddenly have, hey, this has been duplicated before, done before. No? So there is always that thinking that in any research that's going to be done in the digitization of sources, no, is that quality and of course and uniqueness, originality has to be considered. Okay, now problems. It's the last portion. Number one, funding. I've looked at some of the libraries, no, and abroad, and well, so far I've seen several libraries that had already were digitizing sources, but they were not digitizing the rare collections. They're just digitizing journals, no, for access to use to scholars and students. No, funding is difficult because there's equipment for scanning, and of course for the using of the sources themselves once they have been scanned and digitized. Okay, so money always is a problem. Second, preservation. The expertise for handling the sources during digitization and the storage of the originals and the digitized sources isn't simple. Okay, you just don't get the source, no, the primary source, the book or the rare book or manuscript, just lay it down flat on a scanner, then scan it in any other way. No, it has to be handled in a certain way. When the first sources were digitized, were scanned, they had a very big problem because they realized that the heat of the scanner can damage the pages. So they have to use before they were using mylar. Okay. I don't know what's being done today. I'm not updated on that kind of that kind of technology. No? But again, preservation has to be handled in a certain way, and it's not simple. Third, technological capabilities. You can't just upload a digitized source, especially if you're an institution. You have to have a digital platform, no, to for the source to be uploaded and accessed without interfering into the other programs of the institution. Okay, so it has to have a separate platform in order to not only to access it but to read it and of course to download it. And lastly, of course, acceptance. I had to include this, no? Because although it's a very rare occurrence today, no, some researchers still prefer accessing the originals. I've known a instructor before who didn't believe in digitized sources. Whenever there is a historical thesis or dissertation that has to be defended, the number one question that this instructor always asks is that, where did you get your source? If if the student says, I got it from the internet, so from archive.org or whatever library, the instructor unfortunately would say, no, you have to access the original to look at it, which is at the age of technology today somewhat crazy. Although I can blame him. Some researchers still access the originals because sometimes there are details in the primary source that are lost in digitization. It's not perfect. There are some sources so, that have been digitized and looked at and used, but only when the original document was seen, they realized that it had certain writings that were not entirely scanned. And of course, some of the sources cannot be digitized anymore. So you really have to go back to the original source. No? Some sources, especially those sources that are found in Asian museums and libraries. No? Remember, a lot of our texts can be found carved in stone. And it's kind of difficult to just scan them and digitize them. No? Although, yeah, pictures can also be taken. But then again, there are limitations to these kinds of digitization. Okay, so as a final word, probably we can at least open a discussion, your questions in a discussion later. The internet became a vital partner to researchers. Digitization of sources, primary and secondary, placed into the hands of researchers the very thing that they needed to do work. It not only provided them with accessibility, it also opened for them a new vista of thinking no, for new outputs. No, let's change it. New and original outputs. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that I have developed your curiosity to ask questions. Maraming salamat po. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Now, I would like to turn you over to the second speaker. If I may reintroduce the topic of his lecture for this afternoon, Dr. Fernando A. Santiago Jr. will be talking about understanding the Filipinos' sense of Malayness. Bernie?
Good afternoon. I'm sorry for the technical glitch that we had earlier. So my connection is not very strong. So I'm just to play safe. I'm not going to present my PowerPoint presentation, and I hope you will bear with my reading of my paper. Okay, so as I said earlier, the paper, well, the study that I'm sharing is based on a paper to be published in Malaysia called Historicizing Malayness, Spanish Colonialism and the Emergence of the Hispanized Malay. Okay, and the reason I'm sharing it here is because I think many of you would find it interesting. Okay, because I've noticed that the Malaysians in particular have found it to be quite an interesting topic. Now, I'm not the first to do a study on the Malays. There are many notable works. Okay, among them are Contesting Malayness, Malay Identity Across Boundaries by Timothy Barnard. There's Joel Kahn's Other Malays. There's Leaves of the Same Tree by Leonard Andaya. The Malays by Anthony Milner's. Anthony Milner is one of the major works. And Melayu, Politics, Poetics, and Paradoxes of Malayness, edited by Masna Muhammad and Sayyid Muhammad Khairuddin Al-Junaid. Among the Filipino scholars, there are two notable scholars who have written on the Filipinos' Malayness. One is Dr. Zeus Salazar, and of course his work, The Malayan Connection ng Pilipinas sa Dunya Melayu, and Dr. Rommel A. Kuraming, okay, who has published several works, some book chapters and articles on the Malayness of the Filipinos as well. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Understanding the Filipino Sense of Malayness. And I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Okay, so many Filipinos today believe that they belong to the Malay race. We are taught that our national hero, Jose Rizal, is the great Malayan or even the pride of the Malay race. Cultural similarities with the people of Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are also recognized and appreciated. However, we're often surprised to find out that we are not considered to be Malay by most people in the region. We're thus generally unaware of our marginal status, okay, in the Malay world, or also known as the Dunya Melayu. Jeffrey Benjamin describes the Dunya Melayu as encompassing at least Isthmian Thailand, Peninsular Malaysia, Singapore, Central Eastern coast parts of Sumatra, and much of coastal northern, western, and southern Borneo, Brunei, parts of Malaysian Sarawak, and parts of Indonesian Kalimantan. And noticeably, the Philippines, not even Sulu or Mindanao are mentioned. Anthony Milner states that in mainstream thought, members of this particular Malay world, speaking Malay as a first language and professing Islam, would be widely accepted as Malay, and more critically, would probably today think of themselves as Malay. He also says that the classification of virtually the whole population of Indonesia and the Philippines as Malay is not accepted by most scholars. Therefore, as earlier mentioned, aside from the peripheral location of the Philippines, mainstream scholarship excludes Filipinos from the Malay world, thus casting a marginal tone to our claim of Malayness. What has been forgotten in the region is that historically, the Filipinos' ancestors played an active part in the Malay world. Political, economic, sociocultural, and religious developments also hinted the growing influence of the Malayan ecumene as described by Zeus Salazar. The natural course of progress was, however, interrupted by the arrival of the Western powers, which redirected historical trends and detached a large sector of Philippine society from the region. It did not result in the loss of Malayness in the Philippines, but rather the fusion of the ways of the archipelago with Western elements, the synthesis of Malay and Hispanic traditions, and the creation of a unique identity that I call the Hispanized Malay. I must stress that Hispanization occurred at various degrees, with some areas not being influenced at all, such as some parts of Mindanao, which retains a culture that is much closer to that of Indonesia and Malaysia than the rest of the Philippines. Now, Jose Rizal actually had a role in promoting the idea of Filipino Malayness. When he went to London in 1888, he wanted to recover a forgotten past and to establish the existence of an extinct civilization in the Philippines. He wanted to prove with historical facts that the people of the Philippines had not been naked savages rescued only by the Spanish soldiers and friars from utter barbarism. You see, after more than 3 centuries of Spanish rule, the Spaniards' civilizing influence was ingrained in the Filipino mind, a process which began in the 16th century when the conquerors declared pagan artifacts as visible symbols of the devil's domain that had to be destroyed. Memories of olden times faded as people converted to Christianity and adopted Spanish culture. Thereafter, what remained was a condescending attitude towards ancient ways and the emphasis on the progress brought forth by Spanish rule, for which Filipinos were expected to be grateful. While at the British Museum reading room, Rizal found Antonio de Morga's Successors de las Islas Filipinas, which was published in 1609, and it gave him a glimpse of the past that he described as having been erased from memory. But recognizing his own shortcomings as a historian, he decided instead of writing a history book on the Philippines, he would just reprint the book of Antonio de Morga and add his annotations. Okay, and thus what would follow would be the publication of Rizal's second book, which is not the El Filibusterismo, okay, but the Successors de las Islas, the annotated Successors de las Islas Filipinas. Okay, now Dr. Salazar describes the Successors as where the culture and environment of the ancient Filipinos, considered as naturales malayos, are described with sympathy and objectivity. For Schumacher, impartiality was its main virtue. For it to merit serving as the basis for the history of the Filipinos, Reynaldo Ileto viewed this effort as an attempt to construct a usable past, for the Filipino had to move forward, and in order to do so, had to be aware of their history as a colonized people, and the general progress of mankind to which their future should be geared. Now, to highlight little-known details, Rizal called attention to parts of Morga's account that describes indigenous society as it was encountered by the Spaniards. He also brought Filipino behavior noted by Morga into proper context. Now, there were other Ilustrado scholars who pursued ethnography, folklore, and linguistics to discover pre-Hispanic unity among the different peoples of the Philippines. And among the notable scholars were Pedro Paterno, T.H. Pardo de Tavera, and Isabelo de los Reyes. With Rizal's annotation of Morga's Successos, their works gave Filipinos a better appreciation of their ancestors as well as themselves. And with this discovery of the forgotten past came the recognition of the Filipinos' Malay identity, the Malay turn as described by John Nery. Now, Ferdinand Blumentritt, okay, an Austrian ethnographer and a good friend of Rizal, also played an important role in the Malay turn because he was responsible for pointing Rizal towards the Spanish text of Morga's Successors. He got Rizal to first consider his Malay roots, and he also introduced Rizal to the German ethnologists such as Rudolf Virchow, Fyodor Yagor, and members of the Berlin Ethnographic Society and the Berlin Anthropological Society, with whom Rizal learned more about his race. So Blumentritt provided Rizal with the historical source and gave him the objective view of his ancestors, as well as the scientific basis for understanding his race. Now, through extensive correspondence with Blumentritt, Rizal became convinced that Filipinos were the 6 million oppressed Malays, and he himself he called a Tagalog Malay. And this racial identity was also articulated in a letter where Rizal refers to himself and his countrymen as the unfortunate Malays of the Philippines. So Rizal regarded the Filipino people as belonging to the Malay race. So such thinking would eventually spread among Rizal's contemporaries, which later found expression in the efforts to define the Filipino national identity. So the 19th century Ilustrados Malay identity was founded on two grounds, okay, race and culture. On one hand, it was rooted in the recognition of shared biological traits with the people of the region. Although, of course, today um, we'd say that this is an idea that conforms more to 19th century leanings, okay, because the present day consensus among anthropologists is that there are no human biological races, okay, and that race exists as lived social experiences. But we have to see Rizal in the context of his time, okay, when he classified people as if they were different species. Now, on the other hand, the Ilustrados Malay identity was also grounded in the idea of a pre-colonial Malayan way of life that was erased from memory. So eventually, these ideas would spread, and even during the Philippine Revolution of 1896, um, such thoughts were expressed by even Apolinario Mabini. As many of you know, in 1896, militant nationalism gave birth to the Philippine Revolution, the first of its kind in Southeast Asia. And we declared independence on June 12. But not long after that, a war broke out between the Philippines and the United States of America. And before long, the Philippines was colonized again. And during the Philippine-American War, Apolinario Mabini himself, okay, um, understood the revolution with a broader perspective, okay, not just as the revolution of the Filipinos as a movement towards independence from Spain, but as a movement for the liberation of all Malayan people. Okay, so it was not to end in the Philippines. Um, Salazar gives a very good discussion of how Mabini conceived of cooperation, if not union, with other Malay peoples in the future as a bulwark against colonialism. Okay, in fact, when Mabini was asked in the early 1900s by the Americans if the Philippines was ready for self-governance, Mabini said, the Malay peoples are ready to form a confederation of Asiatic states. So Mabini was really thinking ahead. He wasn't just thinking of an independent Philippines. He was thinking of something that would be similar to the European Union today, okay, a confederacy of Asian states made up of the Malay nations. So it was more, again, the Philippine Revolution was therefore more than a struggle for national independence. It was to be a springboard for the liberation of the Malay race. Now, what I just discussed provides a logic to the development of the idea of Maleness among the Ilustrados and how it eventually made its way to other um, uh, thinkers of that period. So it shows how the Filipinos' adoption of the Malay identity was a product of historical conditions. Okay, so that's the thing about identity. Identity can be a fluid concept. Okay, you could have a specific identity at one moment and then a different identity at another. In the same way that we have multiple identities. I am my parents' son. I am a uh, a professor. Okay, so I play different roles and I have different identities as I play my various roles. But even the idea of a national or even racial identity can be quite tricky. So the question that I'd like to move to now is the question of who said that the Filipinos were Malay to begin with? Okay, who said that Filipinos are part of the Malay race? Well, if you look at the Spanish writings, so many of you are, I assume, historians, so you're familiar with the works of Juan de Plasencia, Pedro Quirino, Antonio de Morga, Francisco Colin, Ignacio Alsina, Francisco Combes, Gaspar de San Agustin, even Joaquin de Zúñiga. And the common denominator is that they loosely described Filipinos and their ways as Malayo, Malay, or Malayan. In scholarly circles, it was actually the English writers who led the trend to define the term Malay. Among them was John Crawford, who opens the first chapter of his History of the Indian Archipelago, published in 1820, by describing two aboriginal races of human beings inhabiting the Indian islands. That's the Malay Archipelago. And he said that they were different from each other as both are from the rest of the species. I'm quoting Crawford. One of these races may be generally described as brown complexioned people with lank hair, and the others as a black or rather sooty colored race with woolly or frizzled hair. Okay, so if you're familiar with the Bayer's wave migration theory, the second one described would be the ones related to the Negritos. Nonetheless, among the brown complexioned people Crawford refers to are the Malay Filipinos, for he includes the Philippines in his description of the region's topography. Okay. Another scholar is Alfred Russel Wallace, who is more detailed in his description of the race in his book, The Malay Archipelago. He makes distinctions among groups that he described as the quote unquote true Malay races. And I'll just shorten the quotation, but basically he described them as consisting of four great and a few minor semi-civilized tribes and a number of others who may be termed savages. So the four groups are the Malay proper, the inhabitants of the peninsula, that's present-day Malaysia, and almost all the coast regions of Borneo and Sumatra. The second group, the Javanese, inhabiting Java, Sumatra, Madura, Bali, and parts of Lombok. The third, the Bugis, the inhabitants of the greater part of the Celebes, and there seems to be an allied people in Sumbawa, he said. And then the fourth great race, in the words of Wallace, is that of the Tagalas in the Philippine Islands. Many of them are now Christians and speak Spanish as well as their native tongue, Tagalog. So of interest is his inclusion of the Tagalas. Okay, for not only does he classify them among the true Malay races, he also describes them as Christians and Spanish-speaking and thus Hispanized. Considering the religious and linguistic distinctions pointed out by Wallace, the narrative reveals a standard of Malayness that acknowledges cultural diversity within the race. Now, aside from um, the English writers, There were also English and Spanish ethnographers. There were also Germans who classified the Filipinos as Malay. Among them was Ferdinand Blumentritt. And of significance is a Frenchman, Joseph Montano, who published his report in 1885, and where he describes Filipinos as descended from three ancestral races that arrived in separate waves. So in sequence, he identifies them as Negritos, Indonesians, and Malays. So if you're unaware, this seems to have been the basis of Bayer's wave migration theory, the report of Joseph Montano in 1885. And according to Montano, most of the lowland Filipinos are of Malay ancestry. Okay, so these accounts show the Europeans' consensus on the racial classification of most Filipinos. So, and again, we have to take note that it was them classifying us and not us, okay, telling them what we were. So the usage of the term Malay in the 19th century, scientific circles, signified more the identity constructed by Western thinkers. Okay, so the beginnings of the Eurocentric perspective of the Malay world. And in the words of Professor Murad Merican, illustrative of the European representation of the order or of the other. So the Filipinos' Malayness was not necessarily determined by the Filipinos themselves prior to Rizal and the other Ilustrados. Okay, but it was the Europeans who were telling us that we were Malays. But nonetheless, the Ilustrados embraced these Western ideas as they built their identity with race as only one variable. Because as I said earlier, of equal, if not even greater importance, were the cultural ties that they recognized us having with the rest of the people in the region. Now, the Ilustrados discovered their affinity with the Malay world through the lens of history. Okay, but in their time, they were not aware of what today we consider to be the oldest historical document in the Philippines. That is the Laguna copper inscription, which is written in Old Malay and serves as evidence of Malay culture in the Philippines during ancient times. So dating to around 900 CE and in writing that bears similarities with ancient Kawi script of Indonesia, analysis by experts reveal a language that contained Sanskrit, Old Javanese, Old Malay, and Old Tagalog words. Aside from mentioning toponyms, okay, that are still familiar today, place names rather. It attests to the Hindu influence of the Sumatra-based Srivijayan Empire, which had spread beyond the central part of the Philippine archipelago to the barangays of Tondo and Maynila. Now, citing Antun Postma, who is regarded as the primary expert on the LCI, Dr. Salazar states that the document is considered to be clearly Old Malay and contains several words that are identical or closely related to Old Tagalog. Okay, so it has words like anak, dayang, harapan, utang, ngalan, and other etymologically related words. Furthermore, the inscription is certainly related to, although not identical with the famous uh, Srivijayan inscriptions of the end of the 7th century and several other Malay inscriptions of the 9th century from central Java. Now, the earliest European reference to the Philippines, well, for many of us, we think that the earliest European reference comes from Antonio Pigafetta, who was the chronicler of the Magellan expedition. But the earliest European reference to the Philippines actually comes from Tomé Pires, okay, from his book Summa Oriental. Pires was a Portuguese who stayed in Malacca right after its capture by the Portuguese in 1511. So 10 years before the arrival of Magellan, where he observed Filipinos whom he referred to as Lusoes. He also refers to the Lusoes as the name of the Philippines, okay, named after the biggest island, which is Luzon. Okay, so in his narrative, he describes the active presence of Filipinos and there having been highly involved not only in business but also politics. In fact, though described as heathens, okay, probably because they were not of Islamic background, uh, they were quite successful in Malaysia, okay, during the early 1500s. So they were quite prominent citizens in Malaysia. The value of Pira's account is that it predates the arrival of Magellan's expedition in the Philippines, and it is evidence of the active presence of the pre-colonial Filipinos in present-day Malaysia and Indonesia during the 16th century. By the way, I was planning to show you an excerpt from the account, but since my circumstances do not permit, the account also indicates that there were Filipinos or Lusoes residing on the island of Sumatra. So they were not only in Malacca, in Malaysia, but they were also in Sumatra, in present-day Indonesia. It also documents how deeply immersed ancient Filipinos were in the social, economic, and political life of the region. Now, the next historical document is Antonio Pigafetta's Relazione del primo viaggio intorno al mondo, okay, the account of events of the Magellan expedition, which arrived in the Philippines in 1521. With Magellan was Enrique, his Malay slave, from Malacca, who spoke fluently, who spoke Spanish fluently, and served as the interpreter of the Armada de Maluco on its maiden quest to reach the Spice Islands in 1519. Now, Pigafetta describes how Enrique discovered his ability to communicate with the natives, and it was at that moment that Magellan and his men ascertained that they had arrived at their destination, a confirmation that the world was indeed round. After many months at sea and encountering various peoples, it was the first time that anyone communicated in a language that was commonly understood, the language of Enrique, okay, which was Malay, the lingua franca of the Malay world. By the way, there's no doubt that Enrique de Malacca is Malaysian, okay? And I'm sorry he was not a Filipino, but that's the subject of another paper. Of note is that the expedition did not encounter anyone who spoke Malay beyond the Philippines, thereby suggesting that it was the eastern limit of the Malay world, at least based on language. So beyond the Philippines, the Spaniards did not encounter anyone else who spoke Malay, so none in the Pacific. Aside from language, Pigafetta notes many other details showing the Malay features of Philippine culture. So I'm about to wrap up. There are other observations, such as those from Francisco Colin, okay, who in the early 17th century surmised that Filipinos are descended from the Malays by their language, which he said resembles Malay closely, by the color and lines of the whole body, by the clothing and habit that they wore at the arrival of the Spaniards here, and lastly, by the customs and ceremonies derived from the Malays and other nations of India. And similar observations were made by chroniclers, the ones I mentioned earlier, De Morga, Combes, Gemelli Carreri, San Agustin, okay, Martinez de Zuniga, etc. So there are many accounts of that document Malay culture in Philippine society. Actually, at present, many Filipinos are unaware of common practices that we share with the Malay world. Like, for example, we tend to think that the practice of mano, okay, putting the hand of the elderly to your forehead, is an exclusive Filipino practice, but it isn't. The Indonesians and Malaysians also mano, okay, but the Indonesians call it salim, while the Malaysians refer to it as salam. So the importance we give to politeness, saving face, having a strong family orientation, and even the complex sense of social hierarchy, okay, are just some of the common features that we still find in present-day Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and other parts where Malay communities live. Okay, so the qualities of Malayness are thus very broad, but nonetheless, they are immediately recognized by those who belong to it or by those who claim inclusion. Okay, just like Rizal and the other 19th century ilustrados. So, so again, there are two bases for the view of the Filipino Malayness, that's race and culture, but which over time transformed because of Hispanization. Okay, so but to end my presentation, after more than a century since the Ilustrados began their self-conscious effort to search out and identify the national character, some Filipinos are still coming to terms with their past and asking what it means to be Filipino. For others, the question is now beyond the level of national identity. As the Ilustrados discovered, the common affinity extends beyond the national borders. While the Ilustrados based their regional kinship on race and culture, today, Filipinos, we should be asking ourselves what we consider most essential to who we are as human beings. And it is on this question that we should ground our reflections as we face the challenges of the 21st century. So if you're interested in what I just presented, again, my paper will be published by the ISTAC in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, hopefully sometime soon. Okay, but I think the COVID-19 conditions just caused some delay. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernie, for that wonderful lecture. Shall I now go to the open forum? Oh, no, not the open forum, but it's our turn. The Dr. PM's
Yes.
and I's turn for a bit of a discussion regarding the two papers that were presented.
Okay, but
Okay.
I must do the introduction, of course. We now proceed to the discussion, and our first discussant is an associate professor of the Department of History of De La Salle University. She's also the chair of the Department of History. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Maria Florina Aurelios Juan.
Okay, thank you, Fernie. Thank you once again. I'd like to say hi once again to the audience, and hopefully you're still with us right now. Now, well, I wish to point out two things, and these are actually rejoinders. First, I'd like to mention that, of course, it is an important topic for all of us Filipinos because, as Fernie mentioned in his paper, and I quote, we may be unaware of our marginal status in the Dunya Melayu, while we accept, of course, and while we profess our being, our Malayness in particular, chances are we may be unaware of that, okay? And I want to underscore the fact, of course, that this lesson is not always a part of our Philippine history textbooks, either in basic education or in the tertiary level, except, of course, when the waves of migration theory is being discussed, which to date is no longer, of course, accepted, in the academe. And I think that this is an opportune time for us to, again, tackle this topic as classes, for example, open in the tertiary level. I do hope that some of the curriculum in our subjects would be able to uh, allot a particular lesson on again our being on our sense of Malayness. Second, I am reminded of this particular pattern that you just talked about, how key figures in Philippine history have put forth the idea of our Malayness in order to refute at least two contentions of our colonizers regarding first that of regarding our being uh, open quotation primitive, backward, and much later unfit for independence and self-government. As you have mentioned a while ago, Jose Rizal, together with the other propagandists, his colleagues who were then based in Europe, uh, their assertion of being racially and culturally Malay, they basically used it to counter the accusation of the Spaniards that the Filipinos were barbaric and uncivilized before they arrived, of course, in the 19th century. And then we are reminded again of the stance of Apolinario Mabini in the early 1900s, as you said a while ago, that we are not only ready for self-government, but the rest of the Malay people are just as prepared. So at that particular time, he's very aware that we should really be free from the colonial yoke. Okay? And just to further the discussion, I am suddenly reminded of a lesson that we took up under Dr. Salazar, and this was 25 years ago. Vinson's vision of Malaya Irredenta. I think Dr. Salazar was discussing at that time how in the early 1930s, Vinson's delivered this particular speech where he recalled the splendid past of the Malays, whom he extolled as masters of the seas and praised as political geniuses. So even on to, again, the early 1930s when we were still under the American colonial yoke, there was this group of young scholars from the University of the Philippines who formed that particular organization. And sadly, though, of course, this particular vision of Malaya Irredenta was not realized, at least as it was originally conceptualized, because later on, of course, Mafilindo will be or was, founded. Okay, now to Dr. Torres's paper. Thank you, Dr. Torres, for that enlightening lecture. And as I mentioned to him earlier this morning, I could relate much to what he just talked about. And in fact, I always tell this to my students, particularly those who are taking up historical methodology. I always tell them how fortunate they are because nowadays they could actually undertake research in the comforts of their own homes. I would always relate to them that during my undergraduate years in the University of the Philippines in Diliman, in the early 1990s, the main library became my second home. And I had to master how to use the card catalog. Now, I do not know if any of our students know what a card catalog is. And they live in a technological age where you just type in the keywords, authors, or title in the OPAC, and it will be displayed in a few seconds. In other words, it would be relatively easy for these students to undertake research because of the availability of these primary sources in digitized format. And I also wish to point out two things. Of course, technology enabled researchers and scholars like us to access sources which were unavailable to us before. I would like to make particular mention of the University of Michigan, what we call UMich Philamer. Some or majority of the sources are not only digitized but fully searchable. Of course, I also must make mention in the context of Southeast Asia, the John Eccles collection of Cornell University. It's particularly useful for the travelogues written by different scholars about their various travels in parts of Southeast Asia. Of course, now scholars, Filipino scholars, have access to the archives, the different archives in Spain through the pares.mcu.es. Although not all the documents are digitized, but if you're lucky, you can actually download some pages which are available in the Archivo General de las Indias or Archivo Histórico Nacional. Of course, there's the BNE.es or the Biblioteca Nacional de España, which actually allows you to download some of their digitized sources on the Philippines. And of course, I'm sure that most of us are familiar with archive.org, where you can actually download several books on the Philippines, particularly those that were published in the 19th century. And the second point is, if one wishes to undertake research in Southeast Asia, in particular, in cases where documents have already been digitized and made available for downloading, it would be easier for a scholar or student to write a thesis, a dissertation, journal article, or book. But of course, we have to hurdle another challenge. And sometimes, or oftentimes rather, this is expected of us. When we really want to specialize in one particular country, we should be able to study, pick, and read the particular language where the documents were written. But again, as Dr. Torres mentioned in the conclusion of his lecture, the future is really bright for us scholars, particularly in the field of history, because these are being made available to all of us. Okay, so that's it. Shall I introduce PM Fernie?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the next discussant is Dr. Piem Sak Hong Jaramsil, or Piem for short, Dr. Piem. He received his doctorate in modern history from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid with doctoral dissertation Relaciones entre Siam y Filipinas en la Edad Moderna, siglos XVI hasta XVII, and currently full-time lecturer at the Hispanic and Latin American Studies program of Thammasat University, Thailand. PM?
Okay. Thank you, Rina. Okay, please let me share this one. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. To our guests, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat from Bangkok. And thank you so much to the Salle University, Southeast Asian Research Center and Hub, and the Department of History, especially to Dr. Fernando for inviting me to join this webinar. It's been a great pleasure and honor for me, above all, to Thammasat University, being able to collaborate with the La Salle again after my first visit to the campus as visiting professor back in June 2018. So Pakbati, congratulations to Dr. Fernando, Dr. Jose Victor for the very interesting knowledge and presentations, and to the previous discussions from Dr. Rina. Okay. Some of my observations regarding the first presentation for Civic is about the lack of primary documents in Thailand. I'd like to share that we also experienced quite, I'm not sure whether I can say the same or not, but I am from the modern history department in Madrid, and I know that the first problem for Thai scholars is that we lack the primary sources between the 16th and 18th century. At that time, the capital city of Siam was in Ayutthaya, and as it was burned down in the year 1767 by the Burmese army, so I think almost 0% were left, almost zero. And another reason is that primary sources, most of them were preserved in the palm leaves manuscripts. And the last problems about how Thai scholars, Thai historians work is the funding, as just as Servik has mentioned, and the acceptance of whether you are using the primary sources or not, which is today quite not that much occurrence today. About the second presentation of Dr. Fernando, as a Thai person, I would like to share my experience as foreigner, non-Filipino historian about the Dunia Melayu that he has talked today. That okay, he has talked about the definition of the Malay world, the Malayness from Jeffrey, and the Isthmus of Thailand is already included as well. So I'll just show to all participants how Thai people built the Malayness. If some of you are familiar with Thai map, could you guess which part of Thailand is included in the Malayness, the Malay world? It is one. I've already made the line. It is one. When we talk about the are you Malay, when you talk about Thai people, we will have the imagination of the southernmost provinces of Thailand. So from this map, we can say that the Malayness in Thailand is very, very marginalized. After reading the article of Dr. Fernando, I have called several of my friends who are from the southern part of Thailand. One of them is in Phuket Island, the famous tourist attraction. And I wish some of you might have known it is here, Phuket. It is in the southern part of Thailand. He has brown skin. I asked him whether he identified himself as Malay or not. The answer is no. I don't know, for many reasons, because Phuket created a story related to Chinese diaspora, something like that. So when we talk about the Malayness in Thailand, which is a part of the Dunia Melayu, we talk about the frontier southernmost provinces like Pattani, Yala, Narathiwat. But actually in the 18th century, 19th century, the Muslim part of the Kingdom of Siam also stretched beyond the boundary today of Malaysia in the northern parts. But it was later annexed to the British Empire. This is what for Thai people in the central, on the other part of the country, view the Malay world in our own country. This is the central mosque of Pattani province. It recalls me of a pink mosque in the, if I am not wrong, in Maguindanao province. Okay, talking about the Malayness and relations between Thai and the Philippines, it recalls me of when Magellans arrived to Cebu, and in the chronicle that Ferdinand also mentioned in the Picafetta Chronicles, on the 7th of April, 1521, there was an encounter between the Spaniards who were sent to negotiate with Raja Umabon. And at that space, there appears to be one Muslim Siamese merchant who spoke Malay language. So this is something that from my doctoral dissertation can prove that I think that Thai people, I would say Siamese people, also forms a part of Malay world at that time. I'd like to show you this map because this is something I want to discuss today. I've asked several of my friends, do you consider the Philippines as Malay? 100% of those with whom I talk say no. They don't think that the Philippines form a part of Malay, just as Dr. Fernando has just mentioned, the exclusion of Philippines. After the ASEAN countries has promoted the mutual understanding, they project Thai government as well. We project knowledge about other nations, neighbor countries, so that the children can understand well our neighbors. In my when I was young, it was like the social sciences that teach children about Southeast Asian nations are in the 6th grade until now. So this is the poster like what you can find in the national bookstores, the poster like 20 pesos or something, just like that, but it's sold in Thailand. You can see that virtually the Philippines, the map is practically excluded. if you look at the real map of the Philippines, you have the island of Palawan and at least the archipelago of Sulu, which is around here, which makes Philippines feel like closer to the other archipelagos. But in this map, you can feel that something has been missed. And the second thing is that if we focus on the Malay world, and if the two main elements of being Malay is speaking Malay and practicing Islam, you see the costume of Malaysia and then Brunei and Indonesia. They set the same themes. You see the woman wearing the Brunei Darussalam, the veil, if I'm not wrong, the hijab, am I right? And the Muslim hat in all the Malay, I wouldn't say the Malay, in all the citizens of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Meanwhile, to the Philippines, this is the image of the Philippines being projected to Thai students. Totally westernized, like you have shirts, barong Tagalog, and even though if we analyze it profoundly, it might have some other origins more than the Western world, but at the first glance, we say that it's totally different from the rest of what we are familiar of being Malay world, Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia. I think seeing textbook in Thai is very interesting because I am not sure whether since my day back in the 90s when I was young from until now, the Ministry of Education has changed a lot or not, whether how they narrate of the being of the Filipino, the Filipino identity. You can see that this is the book for children. It's called Kumusta Philippines. I haven't seen any Malay elements, Muslim elements put inside. On the right side of the slide, you can see that everything, almost everything is westernized, Hispanicized. Pawai Church, cathedrals. I delved myself into the exercises they put the students to answers, and they're interesting because none of them deals with how Malay is the Philippines. We all know that in the southern part of the Philippines, you have Maguindanao that's zoned, Yakan culture, Muslim communities, but none of these are presented even in the exercises. For example, in the question 3, 4, or 5, I have translated Christianity, and they suppose the students need to answer Catholicism become Filipino national religion. Jesus is Spain rules the Philippines during how many years? These are the knowledges that I think today makes Thai people think about the Philippines as something very excluded from the rest of the Malay world. Even though I am totally agree with Dr. Fernando that the first time I must confess that I think that the Philippines is Malay was when I studied master degree in Autónoma de Madrid in Spain. When I read the article from my advisor, Dr. Patricio Hidalgo Nuchera, he wrote about the slavery in the Philippines, describing the social hierarchy using what Dr. Ferni as well mentioned in his article, the Successors de las Islas Filipinas from Antonio de Morga. That was the first time. I was around 25 or something. I need to wait until 20 years until I realized how Malay was the Philippines. These are not the examples. I have chosen not whatever the textbook is, but this is the textbook created by the Institute of Asian Studies from Chulalongkorn University, which is quite an accredited institution in Thailand. Chulalongkorn is the first university found in Thailand together with Nanmi Book, which is quite famous. It is this set for children called the Asian Way. I've searched after reading Dr. Fernie's article, how would they project the Philippines? These are Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia. They show a lot of similarities. Meanwhile, I searched for the Philippines book, and this is the result. I haven't seen any of the Muslim or anything they project the Philippines as if it is so westernized. You have Jeepney, the from American period, Jesus Nazareno, the Black Jesus, Rizal, Sampaguita, or even Barong, Terno, Abanico from Spanish culture. And most important is that the place where the Muslim culture, which sometimes represent the Malayness, is hidden after this girl even. And I haven't seen any mosque. So this is what I would like to share with all participants today about situation in Thailand, why other Asian countries, at least in Thai case, we do not have knowledge of the Malayness in the Philippines. It's because the educational system that indirectly forced us to think about the Philippines like that. And this is quite shock to me because Dr. Fernando had just said that we are talking about Malayness in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, you have a lot of tribes. No, I'm so sorry. Lots of people, Pampangueño, Ilocano, Tagalos, Bisaya, and Cebuano. But in this video made by the Ministry of Education called Distance Learning Information Technology Resources that you can click and then you see in YouTube. I check whether how the data is, and in the part of in the 58 seconds, it says that the majority of the Filipino population is Tagalog, and the second majority of the Philippine people is Malay. So it means that the Tagalog and the Malay are from the different kind of people, which quite shocked me and myself as well, because I consider if Malay is Malay, so Malay people should comprise Tagalog, Ilocano, and other parts. Okay, my third observation about Dr. Fernie is that finally, as he has just mentioned, Malayness as European discourse and artifacts. I think that I experienced this myself because I didn't realize how Malay was the Philippines up until I read an article written in Spanish, just like the Ilustrados. I think of myself being, oh my God, I should have been one of them because I need to know some kind of discourse creating through the Spanish sources as well. And the last one is that the Chinese elements of the Filipino identity. I think of Jose Rizal as I'm a foreigner. I think that if I'm not wrong, he has a bit of Chinese ancestry, isn't he? So if Rizal and other propagandists choose to define themselves as Malay, so the Malayness from now or from that time includes the Hispanity and the Chinese as well. So from this reason, I think that we should reinterpret more profoundly the idea of Malayness more than in the Philippines itself. And this is why I think some observations that I get from reading the article of Dr. Fernando, which for me is very useful, fascinating, interesting, and innovative for a Thai scholar, a Thai historian like me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, PM. That was a very enlightening discussion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you a bit about how I came to meet Dr. PM Sak at Thammasat University. Uh, we were a team in the college, actually composed of the dean, the associate dean, and the department chairpersons. And we requested for an audience at the faculty of, uh, is it the College of Liberal Arts, PM? Was it?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, the College of Liberal Arts of TU. And I met him because he was actually teaching a Philippine history course. So from that time on, we continued to communicate until he visited, of course, the Philippines, and we hosted him as a visiting scholar at De La Salle. Now, PM, I think you can enlighten our audience a bit about the program that you are offering at Thammasat University. Can you talk about that, please?
Thank you so much, Rina. Okay. I'm actually from the, as Rina has said, from the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Thammasat University. If you are not familiar with this one, actually I was from the history department, and then as I'm from the Hispanic and Latin American cluster. And last year, the rector of the university has just approved our program to be a new major. So from this year, we're going to begin our first semester as a major. And of course, what is it about the Philippines? Because we have several courses about Hispanic countries, and the Philippines has already been included automatically. So just not to take a lot of times, I'd like just to introduce you the official video. I'll pass you the links today, and just to introduce, not much. For some of you participants are from Philippines, Indonesia, or Malaysia who are interested in collaborating with our department just at De La Salle University, we are really very welcomed, because we have two courses regarding the Philippine history. The one is, this is the video that you can search in the YouTube, and we have also the subtitle in English. This is the latest one. And we also have two subjects about the Philippines. The one is the history of the Philippines, which next year will be renamed the history of the Philippines during the Spanish colonial era. And the other subject regarding the contemporary history of the Philippines from the 19th century up to the presidency of Duterte. This is the latest one. So if some of you are interested in following our page, please do not hesitate to do it, because I think it will be for those who are interested in Hispanic issues, including the Philippines as well. Yes, this is all. Last year, I think 2 years ago, we host the international seminars, to which the University of the Philippines as well attended, together with embassies of several Hispanic and Latin American countries, including the ambassador of the Philippine Embassy in Thailand. It is called the Manila Galleon. Okay, that's all I would like to say about my department today. Thank you for everybody.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Piamsak Hongjam Rasil, for that presentation. Now, unfortunately, this is all our time permits. We will not be able to accommodate questions, but please feel free to send us your questions